giving us a talk about critiquing green energy. All the technology seems to be working today. That's good. I'm happy to be at PIELC again this year. Thank you all for being here. It's always a great crowd. I've spoken here a few times in the past. So today we're going to introduce you to some ideas that you all may be familiar with. Some of you may have heard these ideas before. You may have already hold these beliefs. For others of you, this may be pretty new material. That's fine. I was in the same position about 10 years ago. I was a huge proponent of solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, and all these things. I was basically one of these people, smiling and happy. So I'm going to talk about evolving past that perspective. And you all look like smart people to me. I was able to do it, and I'm not that smart, so I think you can do it. So for our agenda today, here's how it's going to work. We're going to start by looking at an excerpt from an important book by a Canadian deep ecologist named Wilbert. And then we're going to talk about the world of industrial production. It's a world that's mostly hidden from all of us in our day-to-day lives. But it's really important, so we're going to try and lift back that veil and look at what's really going on with industrial production. And then we're going to apply that knowledge to solar power specifically. And then finally, we're going to talk about the implications of this. What does it mean that so many people in the environmental movement are putting their faith into these green technologies? So, these are a couple books written by Wilbert, really phenomenal. Highly recommend them. And I want to read a quote from him. It doesn't explicitly relate to green technology, but I'll explain the connection. So, in The Natural Alien, Wilbert wrote, quote, "In combating exploitation, environmentalists have tutored the developer in the art of careful exploitation. In combating the devaluing of nature, they have embraced a method of study which takes such devaluation as its starting point. And in claiming victory through the spread of resourcism, they have rejected their own moral position and given support to a cultural imperative that neutralizes and debases life itself." That's pretty dense, so we'll go through it bit by bit here. So the first thing is that environmentalists have tutored the developer in the art of careful exploitation. And this has some pretty clear literal meanings. Often if you're, say, fighting a timber sale, you can file an appeal, and then the timber company will just go back and they'll fix the problems in their application. They'll dot all their I's and cross all their T's and send it back in, and it's legal, so it'll go through. So oftentimes these developers, what a terrible word that is, destroyers, right? These destroyers, they're able to learn from their mistakes and refine their language based on what we do as environmentalists. So we've literally educated them on how to follow the rules. And we all know we're at an environmental law conference. The laws, as they are currently written, are not enough, obviously. Everything's getting worse. Species extinctions, toxins, global warming, deforestation, all of these things are headed in the wrong direction. So maybe the scenario is a little different. Maybe instead of a timber sale appeal, maybe they're not breaking the law, but maybe their practices are still really terrible. Maybe they're logging old-growth forest, or they have a toxic waste incinerator in the middle of the community and they're poisoning everyone there. And people are fighting these things and they're creating an uproar. That was the case with this medical waste incinerator that's just north of Salt Lake City. I lived there for a few years, and I was involved in some of the protests against this. Right in the middle of the community, there's literally a school about 100 yards from that facility.
Where was that, sir?
Sorry?
Where was that, sir?
Just north of Salt Lake City, city of North Salt Lake. So oftentimes the solution, when there's this sort of community opposition, is to move to a place where there won't be as much opposition. So we'll build log old growth somewhere else where there's not as much protection for human rights. And there's not as many journalists operating. In this case, they're moving the facility to a more remote area west of Salt Lake, out in the desert there, and they're doubling the size. So, moving on to the quote, Vernon says next, "In combating the devaluing of nature, they, that is we, have embraced a method of study which takes such devaluation as its starting point. And in claiming victory through the spread of resources, they, we again, have rejected our own moral position. So this resourcism that he's talking about is the tendency of environmentalists to define the natural world in terms of benefits to humans. We see this all the time. One of the biggest culprits is this idea of ecosystem services, attempting to quantify what nature does in terms of the services to humans, that servant language. So when deep ecologists examine the case for wind power, or for solar power, or for any of these other green technologies, what we see is a type of resources, like Neil Vernon was talking about. We see people sacrificing the centrality of the planet, sacrificing the centrality of Earth for human creations and modern lifestyle. So this is what Vernon is referring to when he talks about rejecting our own moral position and giving us support to a cultural imperative that neutralizes and debases life. And it's this trend which is so incredibly popular right now that we're here to talk about today. So let's step away from the philosophy, that stuff's kind of dense. Let's go back to the real world. If there's one thing that ties together all the green technologies, it's industrial production. I made this handy little slide, it's very simplified, but basically this is how things are produced. You have exploration, they have to go out and find the materials needed, you have to extract them, concentrate and refine those so they're useful. Then you have to fabricate them into parts, assemble those parts into working solar panels or whatever it is. You have to find land to use for those things. You have to install them and use them, provide maintenance, and at the end of the life you have disposal. And of course, we can talk about recycling and closed loop cycles and things like that. But the reality is that those are actually myths. There's not a single green technology in the modern world that has a closed loop cycle. Every step of the way, when you look at something like a solar panel, it creates havoc in the real world. Every step of the way. So we're going to talk about solar power now more. And of course, solar power, you need lots of sun. The best place in North America for solar is the Mojave Desert, which is on the east side of the Sierra Mountains, mostly eastern California, parts of Nevada, a little bit of Arizona and Utah. It's an incredible desert. It's 300 or 400 square miles, something like that. And to help you get a sense of this place, I want to read you part of a poem that Diane Siebert wrote about the Mojave Desert. She wrote, "I am the desert, I am free, come walk the sweeping face of me. Through canyon eyes of sandstone red, I see the hawk, his wings outspread. He sunward soars to block the light, and casts the shadow of his flight upon my vast and ancient face, whose deep arroyos boldly trace the paths where the setting waters run. Long strings of tears drive by the sun. I feel the windstorm's violent thrust. I feel the sting of sand and dust. As bit by bit and year by year, new features on my face appear. Great mountain ranges stretch for miles, decrease my face with frowns and smiles. My lakes are dry and marked by tracks of zigging, zagging, long-eared jacks. Dust devils swirl and slowly rise. They whistle, whirling to the skies, while tossed and blown in great stampedes are stumbling, bumbling tumbleweeds." So it gives you a little sense of the place. It's incredibly beautiful, incredibly important, and very few people have heard of it. So contrasting with that beautiful image, we have this. This is the Ivanpah concentrated solar powered thermal plant in California. It's the largest of its kind in the world. It produces nearly 4 gigawatts of power. And this is the largest of 9 major solar power projects that have been built in the Mojave Desert thus far. Many more are proposed. The federal government has created a special development zone in the Mojave Desert to streamline the permitting process for these types of facilities. I recommend a group called Basement Range Watch if you want to learn more about what's going on in that area. So before this facility was built, this area, this is 3,500 acres, this was described as pristine desert by Sean Gonzalez, who's a Mojave Desert advocate. It's no longer pristine, as you can see. This is more than 3 miles across and can be seen from space. This slide shows some of the desert being destroyed during the construction. You had the destruction of long-lived desert plants like yucca, a lot of other rare plants, and you also had a lot of destroyed habitat for the desert tortoise. The desert tortoise is a threatened species listed under the Endangered Species Act. Their populations are down about 90%. And they're pretty incredible creatures. They can live to be more than 80 years old. They can go for a year without drinking any water. So originally, the BLM believed that there were about 30 desert tortoises in the area where they were going to build avian. But when they went in and actually started doing it, they ended up having to relocate and forcibly remove 170 desert tortoises. And it's estimated that dozens, maybe even hundreds more were killed. These tortoises spend most of their lives underground, so when they drive the heavy equipment over the top, that's going to collapse. So we're talking about tortoises either crushed or buried alive. This isn't just a problem here. Desert tortoises are being impacted by development across the Mojave region, from Las Vegas in the east all the way over. This is the military base in California, 29 Palms, and the standard practice is when they find desert tortoises is not to stop the development, it's to relocate the tortoises. And most often it doesn't work. Often they die. They have to build fences to keep them away because they want to go back to their home. So that's a little bit of the destruction caused by the installation of this facility. So the operation of a concentrated solar power plant like Ivanpah, I don't know if people know how it works, but basically you have those towers. Let me go back to that slide real quick. So you've got these towers, these are all ears, and they concentrate the sunlight on the top of that tower where it heats some sort of medium, oftentimes it's salt. They heat it to a molten form, and then that salt is used to boil water, which then the turbine and generates electricity.
How tall is that tower?
459 feet, I believe. Think about 1.5 times as tall as the Statue of Liberty. So what happens in these facilities is that from far away these look like a lake. And insects are drawn to the light, birds are drawn by the insects, they're drawn by the appearance of water, and they come in from miles and miles around. And then you have predatory birds following the insect eaters. And what happens is they fly into the path of the mirrors, and their wings get burned and singed. And sometimes they even get vaporized. The vaporization is important to know about because these types of facilities are required to count how many birds they kill. But of course, if they're vaporized, there's nothing to count, right? So there are a few of the birds. So this is a screenshot of a video from the Crescent Dunes solar thermal project, which is nearby Ivanpah. And it's not very good quality. There's some dirt smudges on the lens and stuff, but these white spots are actually birds vaporizing and leaving little trails of smoke. Here's a quote from an article about this. The investigators could not identify many burnt objects, which they called streamers. We observed many streamer events, the report said. It is claimed that these events represent the combustion of loose debris or insects. Although some of the events are likely that, there were instances in which the amount of smoke produced by the ignition could only be explained by a larger flammable biomass such as a bird. There's more of that euphemism, biomass, instead of the body that will live in the future. Indeed, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff observed birds entering the solar flux and igniting, consequently becoming a streamer, on average every 2 minutes. So since Ivanpah opened, hundreds and thousands of birds have been documented as being killed or injured, including McGillivray's warblers, blue-gray gnatcatchers, peregrine falcons, Wilson's warblers, horny doves, yellow rush warblers, vermin, and house finches. And so far on a worldwide scale, when you look at bird deaths due to solar and you compare it to something like coal, the deaths from solar are way smaller. But one thing that's important to note about that is that solar is a tiny fraction of global energy supply right now, still. So if you want to talk about ramping that up, then you're going to see more bird kills. A more equal comparison would look at the number of birds killed per amount of energy produced. And when you look at those numbers, concentrated solar power is actually pretty close to coal. Wind turbines, of course, are even worse for birds than solar is. They seem to spin slowly from afar, but the tips of the blades of wind turbines can move 200 miles an hour. And birds aren't used to anything moving that fast, except for maybe one of those peregrine falcons. But they don't see those coming either. So many birds are just struck and killed by wind turbines. Others are maimed. It's really bad. If you want to spend an afternoon in tears, you can do some YouTube searches about what happens to birds in their wind turbine facilities. We're talking beaks and wings and heads just shattered or completely torn off. The other way that birds and bats are killed by wind turbines is maybe even more gruesome. Wind turbines displace a huge amount of air as they spin, so they create a pressure differential behind the blade. And this pressure change is so drastic that if a bird or a bat flies into it, even if they're not struck by the blade itself, the pressure can explode their eardrums and their cardiovascular system. It literally just pulps their body almost from the inside out. This is called barotrauma. Pretty bad. So I'm sorry, it's pretty heavy stuff here. So, but I think it's important. We need to look at this. We need to be honest about it. So let's talk about a few numbers. A 2015 report from the American Bird Conservancy estimated that about 80,000 wind turbines have been put up or are going to be put up in critical habitat corridors for protected bird species, which incidentally often happen to be the best places to put up wind turbines. Another report estimated that more than 573,000 birds were killed by wind turbines in 2012, and projected 1.4 million birds killed per year if the U.S. expands wind farms to just produce 20% of our electricity.
What was that number?
They're projecting 1.4 million bird kills per year if wind farms provide 20% of U.S. electricity. So, when we talk about numbers like this, we need to talk about what is happening in the modern environmental movement today. There's this huge trend talking about 100% clean energy. And I'm as much opposed to fossil fuels as anyone else. I've done nonviolent civil disobedience against fossil fuels. I advocate for even more to be done against fossil fuels. Obviously, they're perhaps the worst problem we're facing in the environmental movement. But a so-called clean energy economy is not that much different. That's the whole point of this talk. So there's this guy named Mark Jacobson. He's a Stanford engineering professor, and he's kind of a celebrity right now in the environmental movement. He's on TV, he's in newspapers, he's in magazines, he's published in all the major scientific journals, and he's got these plans for 100% clean energy. And he calls for 19 million megawatts of wind turbines to be built. And when you run the numbers on that, that could lead to 1,800 bird deaths per hour, which translates to 300,000 per week, more than 15 million per year. And those are pretty conservative estimates. This is, did I skip one? That went in the wrong order. So this is Altamont Pass in California, east of the Bay. It's nicknamed the Cuisinarts for birds. In 2004, a study at this facility found that it had killed at least 116 gold eagles, 300 red-tailed hawks, 333 American kestrels, 380 burrowing owls, more than 2,500 rock doves, 217 northern flickers, more than 2,500 western meadowlarks, 10 gray horned owls, 49 barn owls, 48 ravens, 24 Regan's hawks, and 215 mountain bluebirds. And that's not even a complete list of the species documented in the study. So if you want to talk about bats, the impact of wind turbines on bats is even worse than it is on birds. in the United States alone, the number of bats killed by wind 600 to 900,000 in 2012. And wind energy was a tiny fraction of our energy supply in 2012. 600 to 900,000 bats killed. So if wind power expands like Jacobson and other advocates want, we could be looking at 150,000 bats being killed per hour on average around the planet. Bats can't take that. Birds can't take that. And we can't allow that to happen. These are industrial scale facilities with industrial scale impacts. And those impacts come at every scale, every step of the process, not just their operation. Let's take one step back and look at production. What goes into making one of these facilities? So Ivanpah, for example. Here are some of the materials that went into constructing the Ivanpah concentrated solar power plant. 173,500 heliostats, each composed of 2 mirrors. 20,000 gallons of water per day. 7,500 tons of steel. 36,000 cubic yards of concrete. This is a huge project. Then we can look at hazardous materials. So solar photovoltaics, for example. The Oregon Department of Transportation says, quote, many different potentially hazardous chemicals are used during the production of solar cells. Now some of these are hydrogen fluoride, hydrochloric, sulfuric, and nitric acid, sodium or potassium hydroxide, silane gas, lead, phosphine or arsenic gas, phosphorus oxychloride and trichloride, boron bromide and trichloride, hydrogen peroxide, ion amine catalyst, stannic chloride, tantalum pentoxide, titanium and titanium dioxide, diborane, ethyl acetate, and ethyl vinyl acetate. I'm sure there are others, those are just the ones that I can find in my research. And these are not benign substances, not even close. So when you see those, those slick marketing images with the green solar panels and the nice green field and the blue sky, you're not really seeing what goes into these things. Or we can look at greenhouse gases. Surprise, did you know that making solar panels releases greenhouse gases? It's now the leading, among the leading sources of hexafluoroethane, nitrogen trifluoride, and sulfur hexafluoride. These are used for cleaning the plasma etching equipment that's used to etch the solar cells themselves. Hexafluoroethane is 12,000 times more potent than CO2, molecule to molecule. Nitrogen trifluoride is 17,000 times more powerful. Sulfur hexafluoride is 25,000 times more powerful. And nitrogen trifluoride, for example, is rising at 11% per year in the atmosphere concentrations. Or we can look at the other end of the life cycle of these products. We can look at disposal. And again, the Oregon Department of Transportation says, quote, some panels could be classified as hazardous waste due to lead content from soldering or from glass, which has the potential to leach. Now, of course, I mentioned recycling and closed-loop production earlier. And many of the materials in solar panels, batteries, inverters are recyclable. But just because they are recyclable doesn't mean that they will be recycled. Less than 10% of e-waste is actually recycled at this point. And that recycling process itself isn't necessarily a positive thing for the environment. I don't know if you've ever been to a recycling facility, but they're pretty bad. They're factories, basically. Lead recycling is particularly one of the dirtiest, most toxic industries on the planet. And of course, lead acid batteries are one of the most common types of batteries used in home solar installations. Solar waste is an increasing problem. There's a 2011 report from the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, community watchdog group, and they write, quote, as the solar industry expands, little attention is being paid to the potential environmental and health costs of that rapid expansion. The most widely used solar PV panels have the potential to create a huge new source of electronic waste at the end of their useful lives, which is estimated to be 20 to 25 years. New solar PV technologies are increasing efficiency and lowering costs, but many of these use extremely toxic materials or materials with unknown health and environmental risks, including new nanomaterials and processes. So that was a lot of information. I need a little water. Sure you want me to call it too. So that was a lot of information. Let's go back to the big picture here for a minute. Let's step away from the specifics.
Can I just ask quickly, do you have a handout or anything that has any of this information on it, or is it just...
No, if you leave me your information, I'm actually working on a book with a few other authors on this right now.
Okay.
There's already a great book that's released called Green Illusions by a guy named Ozzy Zahner.
Okay.
He's got a couple of talks on YouTube as well.
Okay.
But all this information is available. You know, I'm basically just doing research like anyone else would do research to find this out. So all of this is available. And there'll be time for more questions at the end. And, I can give you my email or something. So most people believe that the function of green technology is to protect the planet, but that's not true. The main purpose of green technology is to protect the high-energy, modern industrial lifestyle. I'll say that again. The main purpose of green technology is to protect the high-energy, modern industrial lifestyle. When most people in the environmental movement look at green technologies, they're making a bunch of mistakes in how they speak and how they think. They're looking at the technology and they're comparing it to fossil fuels, and they're perceiving that harm reduction is taking place. And their mistake is twofold, at least. First, they're assuming that green energy technologies actually displace fossil fuel technologies. When you bring solar power online, you shut down coal power plants. And second, they're assuming that harm reduction is a sufficient approach. Because that's what we're talking about, obviously, is harm reduction, not harm elimination. So on that first point, there's a professor here at the University of Oregon named Richard York, really nice guy. A lot of his research is focused on this issue of displacement, what they call displacement. And his conclusions are pretty startling. By the way, this is just a bunch of big businesses in the U.S. military. So York published an article in Nature Climate Change, probably the most prestigious climate journal in the world. And in the article he says, quote, "A fundamental, generally implicit assumption of the IPCC report and many energy analysts, we can add environmentalists to that list. So the fundamental assumption is that each unit of energy supplied by non-fossil fuel sources takes the place of a unit of energy supplied by fossil fuel." He says that's the assumption. And then he goes on to say, "However, owing to the complexity of economic systems and human behavior, it is often the case that changes aimed at reducing one type of resource consumption, either through efficiency or by developing substitutes, do not lead to the intended outcome when net effects are considered." He goes on and says, "The average pattern across most nations of the world over the past 50 years is that each unit of energy use from non-fossil fuel energy sources displaced less than 1/4 of one unit of fossil fuel energy use. And specifically focusing on electricity, each unit of electricity generated by non-fossil fuels displaced less than 1/10 of a unit of fossil fuel electricity." So what he's saying is if you want to turn off that coal power plant that's providing electricity, you have to build 10 times as much electricity generation from solar or wind or anything else. This is a critical point that most people don't really understand. And what's really happening here? In our society, new energy sources generally don't replace the old and inefficient polluting energy sources. That makes total sense when you look at how the economy works. We live in an industrial economy in which wealth is generated by energy. So the more total energy a nation can produce, the more wealth it can generate. And that makes policies like Obama's all of the above energy policy make total sense. Because more wealth makes the American standard of living, the high energy lifestyle, more possible. So there's a really great headline from The Onion, you know, how they sometimes, the fake news site, you know, how they sometimes have headlines that are way better and more true than the real news. Their headline was, quote, "Scientists continue developing alternative energy sources for Americans to waste." I think it's, pretty brilliant. And then there's a video attached to this, and in the video they say, quote, "Engineers are hard at work discovering greener ways to power our lives using hydrogen cells, which they say will allow us to thoughtlessly squander our world's resources for years to come."
Maybe that's the only people who would take the ride.
Yeah. So, it sounds like a joke, but this is actually a really fundamental point. Right? It's so important. What is all this green energy actually going to be used for? So let's go back to Ivanpah. The project manager for the construction of the Ivanpah concentrated solar plant was this man, Giovanni, who is now the executive vice president of the oil, gas, and chemicals leadership team at Bechtel. And when the plant opened, he said, quote, "This is a project where we're creating a lot of jobs for the community. We're creating an energy source that's renewable for years to come. We have a limitless energy source, and our children will benefit because we're having less greenhouse gases." First of all, I feel obliged to point out how ironic it is that he built this project that's sort of lauded as this huge environmental victory, and now he's the leader of the oil, gas, and chemicals team. It's a little Orwellian. But I think we should talk about this limitless energy source that he's so excited about. Like we said, limitless energy source. Do you think that Bechtel Corporation, the largest engineering and construction company in the United States, $37 billion in revenue in 2014, do you think they're going to use a limitless energy source to do wonderful things in the world? Do you think they're going to use it to end poverty, challenge capitalism, dismantle white supremacy, fight patriarchy, restore the land, feed the hungry, any of those things? It's not too likely, right? They're going to use it to do the same type of things that they've always done. Bechtel built the Hoover Dam. They built the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. They built the first commercial nuclear power plant in the world. The Trans Mountain Pipeline in Canada. Major highways, undersea tunnels. They're also a war profiteer. They earned hundreds of millions in Iraq on non-competitive contracts. So this company will not use limitless energy to make the world a better place. There's absolutely no chance. And these are the institutions that are pushing so-called green energy. And this is why you're seeing the U.S. military and big corporations adopting these so-called green technologies more and more. They recognize that when your goal is full spectrum dominance, as the U.S. military has written, or profits above all else in the corporate world, that these technologies are actually a great fit. They work really well. Giovanni also said in that quote, "Our children will benefit because we're having less greenhouse gases." Not the most grammatical sentence. Obviously, he's not talking about desert tortoise children. Obviously, he's not talking about McGillivray's warbler children. Obviously, he's not talking about Rusty's desert mallow children. We could probably assume, given Bechtel's track record, that he's also not talking about poor children, or indigenous children, or the children who are mining rare earth metals in China, or cutting down trees to make charcoal in the Amazon rainforest. From his actions, from the actions of the institutions that he's a part of, we can assume that he meant exactly what he said. Our children. He means wealthy, white, human children born in industrialized nations. So this is the sort of thing that Wilbert was talking about when he wrote about the perils of resourcism and the dangers of sacrificing our own moral position. This is the danger. Our movement has been subverted. So where do we go from here? How do we take this information, apply it to our work as environmental activists and people who want to stop the destruction of the planet? So, have you heard of the game Would You Rather? It's that, it's that game. It's sort of morbid where you sit down with your friends and you say, okay, would you rather, pierce your arm with a red hot nail or have your fingernails pulled out or something like that? Right, pretty bad. Morbid game. I've never been one for, horror movies or anything like that. I'm kind of squeamish. So usually my response in that situation is, I want neither. I don't want to play. I don't want anything to do with this game. And that's the point when it comes to green technology and all these green energies and comparing them to fossil fuels. We're being presented with a false choice. It's a false choice. Big environmental organizations, cities, governments, all other sorts of authorities are telling us that we need to choose fossil fuels or we need to choose green energy. I choose neither. I'm a radical, and what I mean by that is that I'm interested in getting to the root of problems. For me, for us, harm reduction is not enough. If you look at something like slavery, you say, oh, let's regulate this system, let's reduce the harms it causes, and let's call that good enough. Because after all, it provides us with some benefits. No, of course not. You say we want to abolish slavery, we need to get rid of this system. When you look at the exploitation of people, the vast majority of women and children forced into prostitution, for example, through drugs or coercion or simply desperation. You say, let's legalize this industry, let's regulate it, let's make it the best it can be. No, of course not. You say, this is an industry that preys on people, it's predatory, it's preying on vulnerable people, and we need to get rid of it. There are some amazing women doing some incredible work on that. I recommend you look into the Nordic model of combating prostitution. So when I look at wind power, solar power, hydropower, electric cars, I see an industrial system that's murdering the planet. The nature of that murder is little different than with fossil fuels. But when you choose either fossil fuels or green energy, you're condemning mountains to being ripped open. You're condemning communities to being poisoned. You're condemning wild creatures and wild places to destruction. And we can do better than this. I think as an environmental movement, we need to do better than this. We need to fight fossil fuels while our dying there. And we also need to fight this green energy technology. I believe that rejecting green technology is actually the starting point for a true environmental movement. It's not environmentalists to believe that sacrificing the Mojave Desert tortoises for human energy is okay. It's not environmentalists to condemn billions of birds and bats to that heart-bursting death of wind turbines. It's not environmentalists to build a movement around technologies that require steel and aluminum and concrete ripped from the earth. When I see so many people rallying around these technologies, I see people working to save themselves and their high-energy civilization. Look at Lester Brown, for example, with his famous book, Plan B, Mobilizing to Save Civilization. He's being explicit where others are only euphemistic. He's not saying saving indigenous cultures, not saving land-based ways of life, not saving the living world, not protecting the planet, but what he says, saving civilization. Aldo Leopold wrote that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. What would it mean to truly embrace this land ethic? What would it mean to build our movements based on a true biocentrism? What would it mean to accept that industrialism is not the answer? As a starting point, it would mean abandoning our allegiance to these false solutions. It would mean committing to revolutionary levels of change from what we were accustomed to. And that's the step I'm asking you to take tonight. To shift your thinking so that you put the planet ahead of this culture, ahead of modern conveniences, ahead of our high-energy lifestyle. We can live without our gadgets, we can live without oil or wind turbines or solar power, but we can't live without a living planet. And beyond ourselves, morality demands that we allow the rest of the world to live. When I look at the modern environmental movement, I see a movement that's enthralled to technology and worshiping electric power. I see a complete reluctance to engage in struggle. I think we need to think systematically. We need to look at the institutions and centers of power that drive forward and maintain car culture, maintain fossil fuels, maintain industrial civilization. We need to look at these and name them as our enemies. And then we need to dismantle them. So this is not a talk about reformism, about how to make a million personal lifestyle changes until we get to the utopia. I'm all for making the right decision, but I think it's absolutely more critical that we force those in power to stop what they're doing and the earth destruction. Now, during World War II, there was a German named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and his conscience would not allow him to stand with the right. And so he turned traitor and he attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler, and he was caught. And he knew that this would be a decisive action if he was able to succeed, that it could save millions of lives. But he was caught and he was awaiting execution in the Nazi jail cell. And he wrote this, quote, "We have spent too much time in thinking, supposing that if we weigh in advance the possibilities of any action, it will happen automatically. We have learned rather too late that action comes not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility." A friend of mine once said that we need to focus on strategies that have the best chance of success, rather than those which simply postpone the destruction. That's what I'm interested in. I think that's what we're all interested in, strategies that have the best chance, because we can't afford failure. I believe that our best chance of success at saving the planet has absolutely nothing to do with wind turbines, or solar panels, or electric cars, or any of these green technologies. Instead, I think, as Arndad Roy has written, she said, "It lives low on the ground, with its arms around people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that their forests, mountains, and rivers will protect them." And I think that is the dedication and spirit that we will need to have if we want to save the planet. So that's it.